The clinking of my mother's teacup against its saucer was the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence following her pronouncement. "So, we've decided, dear," she'd said, her smile as bright and insubstantial as the chintz curtains in their sunroom, "that the money your grandfather left you would be best used to finally get the conservatory built. And perhaps a new car for your father. His old one is looking so shabby." My father, Arthur, a man whose opinion usually followed my mother's like a well-trained spaniel, nodded in agreement, a satisfied look on his face as if this grand decision was a testament to his own sagacity. The family meeting they'd called, ostensibly to discuss summer vacation plans, had taken a rather unexpected detour into the realm of my personal finances. My name is Julian Thorne, 47 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I've worked as a forensic genealogist and estate researcher. My life is a meticulous navigation of wills, trusts, probate records, and the often tangled branches of family trees, unearthing truths that time and complicated human relationships have tried to obscure. I deal in facts, in documented evidence, in the unassailable logic of legal succession. My mother's casual declaration, therefore, landed not as a suggestion, but as a monumental error in archival interpretation. I took a slow sip of the lukewarm tea they'd served me, the floral pattern on the cup a jarring contrast to the predatory gleam in my mother's eyes. "The inheritance from Grandpa Thomas, you mean?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral, betraying none of the sudden, cold alertness that had snapped into place within me. Grandpa Thomas, my mother's father, had been a man of quiet wisdom and considerable foresight. He'd seen the world, made his fortune in a series underscore shrewd, unglamorous investments, and had always possessed a keen understanding of his own daughter's aspirational tendencies. He'd passed away 2 years prior, leaving me a significant sum, not as a windfall, but as a carefully constructed legacy within an irrevocable trust, a trust he and I had discussed at length during his final years. He had been more of a father to me than Arthur ever was. "Yes, that's the one, dear," Mother chirped, already mentally redecorating the non-existent conservatory. "It's just sitting there, isn't it? Not really doing anyone any good. And we, your parents, have needs." Needs. It was a word my mother often used, a nebulous term that could encompass anything from a new set of dinnerware to a down payment on a timeshare they couldn't afford. My father chimed in. "Your grandfather always said family should help family. And this conservatory, Julian, it would add so much value to the house. It's an investment, really. An investment in their comfort, using my inheritance." The audacity was breathtaking, yet disturbingly not entirely surprising. This wasn't the first time my parents had viewed my resources as an extension of their own. My mind, trained to sift through layers of information, began a process. The inheritance was not just sitting there. It was carefully managed by a corporate trustee, according to the explicit terms of Grandpa Thomas's will, terms that stipulated it was for my sole benefit, to be used for my long-term security, my future projects, or to pass on to my own children, should I ever have them. Accessing it, especially for something as frivolous as a conservatory or a new car for my father, would require far more than a casual family decision over tea and biscuits. What my parents didn't know, or perhaps had conveniently chosen to forget, was that my profession had made me intimately familiar with the precise legal mechanisms Grandpa Thomas had employed to protect his legacy, and by extension me. They saw me as Julian, their quiet, somewhat bookish son, the one who dealt with dusty old papers. They didn't see Julian Thorne, the forensic researcher who could trace a misfiled codicil through 3 counties or expose a fraudulent claim to an estate based on a single anachronistic signature. I finished my tea, the silence stretching. My mother was looking at me expectantly, her smile unwavering. My father was already mentally calculating the square footage of the new conservatory. "That's certainly a significant proposal, father," I said finally, my voice betraying nothing. "I'll need to give it some thought. Review the terms of Grandpa's trust again. It's been a while." This was a lie. I knew the terms of that trust, as well as I knew my own name. My mother's smile faltered slightly. "Thought? What's there to think about, dear? It's for the family. It's what Thomas would have wanted. No, I thought it's precisely what Thomas had taken great pains to prevent. He'd seen their profligate tendencies, their inability to manage their own finances, which were comfortable enough thanks to his earlier generosities, but never quite enough to satisfy my mother's ever-expanding list of needs. He'd once told me, during one of our long talks in his study, surrounded by his books and maps, "Julian, my boy, money in the wrong hands is like water in a sieve. It's not about the amount. It's about the integrity of the vessel. I'm leaving this to you because I trust your vessel." I stood up. Well, I should be going. Lots of research to catch up on. I offered a polite, non-committal nod. No arguments, no accusations. Not yet. That would be like presenting a preliminary finding without all the supporting documentation. My parents exchanged a look, a flicker of something, annoyance, impatience, in their eyes. They had clearly expected immediate, enthusiastic agreement, perhaps even gratitude for their grand vision for my money. As I drove away from their meticulously manicured suburban home, a cold resolve settled within me. This wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about a lifetime of subtle manipulations, of casual disregard for my autonomy, of their ingrained belief that what was mine was, by some unwritten familial law, ultimately theirs to command. They had misread the archive of our relationship. They had underestimated the quiet diligence of the archivist. And they were about to discover that some trusts are, indeed, irrevocable, and some boundaries, once crossed, trigger a response as predictable and unyielding as the laws of primogeniture. The first step, as always, was to consult the primary sources, to re-examine the foundational documents, and then to prepare a comprehensive and irrefutable addendum to their ill-conceived proposal. My grandfather had taught me the value of thorough preparation. It was a lesson my parents were about to learn, whether they appreciated it or not. Their casual bomb had not induced panic. It had initiated a forensic review. The drive back to my quiet apartment, a sanctuary filled with books, maps, and the ordered calm of my research materials, was a period of intense internal processing. My parents' audacity, while not entirely out of character, had reached a new, more aggressive level. Their casual assumption that Grandpa Thomas's carefully constructed legacy was theirs to dismantle for a conservatory and a new car was more than just entitlement. It was a profound disrespect for his wishes and a complete disregard for my own financial autonomy. I thought back to my grandfather. Thomas Hamilton had been a self-made man, a civil engineer who had worked on projects across the globe, from the dusty plains of Africa to the burgeoning cities of Southeast Asia. He was a man of quiet intellect, immense practicality, and a deep-seated belief in the importance of self-reliance. He had been generous to his daughter, my mother, throughout her life, providing for her education, helping with the down payment on their house, and often stepping in to bridge the gap when her and my father's financial mismanagement led to predictable shortfalls. But he was no fool. He understood my mother's tendency towards extravagance, her inability to distinguish between a want and a genuine need. He'd seen how my father, a man whose career in middle management had been unremarkable and whose primary ambition seemed to be a comfortable retirement funded by others, enabled and often participated in her financial whims. The inheritance he left me was not just money, it was a statement. It was a deliberate act of placing his trust and a significant portion of his hard-earned wealth into hands he believed would be responsible stewards. He'd involved me in the process of setting up the trust, explaining the legal framework, the role of the corporate trustee, and the specific clauses he'd included to protect the principal from frivolous claims or poor investments. "This isn't for frittering, Julian," he'd said, his gaze firm over the rim of his spectacles. "This is for building, for your future, for creating something lasting, or for ensuring your own stability in a world that is often anything but. Your mother, she means well, but she sees money as something to be spent to acquire things that bring fleeting pleasure. I want you to see it as a tool, a foundation." His words echoed in my mind now, a stark contrast to my mother's cheerful declaration about the conservatory. The first thing I did upon reaching my apartment was to unlock the fireproof safe where I kept my most important personal documents. I retrieved the thick file labeled Hamilton Trust. Inside were copies of Grandpa Thomas's will, the detailed trust agreement, correspondence with the corporate trustee, and my own notes from my discussions with him. I spread the documents out on my large oak desk. The familiar scent of old paper and printer's ink a comforting anchor in the sudden turmoil. I reread the key clauses. The language was precise, unambiguous, a testament to my grandfather's thoroughness and the skill of his solicitor. The trust was indeed irrevocable. I was the sole named beneficiary. The corporate trustee had a fiduciary duty to manage the assets according to the terms laid out, which emphasized long-term growth and preservation of capital, with distributions to me for specific, well-justified purposes such as education, significant life events, or major investments that aligned with the trust's objectives. A conservatory for my parents' suburban home and a new car for my father did not, by any stretch of the imagination, fall into these categories. There is also a spendthrift clause, a common feature in such trusts, designed to protect the assets from the beneficiary's own potential recklessness, or, more pertinently in this case, from the claims of creditors or the undue influence of others. My parents, in their casual covetousness, were essentially attempting to exert undue influence. My next step was to contact my own solicitor, Alastair Finch, coincidentally sharing a first name with my professional persona, a detail that sometimes caused mild confusion but also a sense of kismet. Alastair was a seasoned estate lawyer, a man whose understanding of trusts and fiduciary law was as deep and intricate as my knowledge of 18th-century parish registers. I consulted him when Grandpa Thomas first proposed the trust structure, and he had reviewed all the documentation, confirming its robustness. I called him immediately. "Alastair," I began after the initial pleasantries, "I have a somewhat delicate family matter involving the Hamilton Trust. It appears my parents have developed ambitious plans for its disbursement, plans that are entirely at odds with its stated purpose and my grandfather's explicit wishes." I outlined my parents' proposal. Alastair listened patiently, a series of thoughtful hums his only interruption. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then, at the dry chuckle, "Julian, your parents seem to be operating under the rather charmingly antiquated notion of what's yours is ours, dear boy. The conservatory, you say? And a new motor car for your father? How delightfully optimistic of them." His tone, though laced with a touch of wry amusement, quickly became serious. But optimism, unfortunately, does not override the clear and binding terms of an irrevocable trust. From what you've described, and from my recollection of the Hamilton Trust documents, their proposal is a non-starter. The corporate trustee would be in serious breach of their fiduciary duty if they even entertained such a disbursement for those purposes without your explicit, and I would argue, ill-advised, consent to somehow circumnavigate the trust's intent. "That's what I presumed," I said. "But my concern is their persistence. My mother, in particular, could be remarkably tenacious when she believes she is entitled to something." "Ah, yes," Alastair said. "The matriarchal prerogative. A formidable force, but not, I assure you, one that holds much sway in a court of law when pitted against a well-drafted trust. What we need to do, Julian, is twofold. First, you need to communicate your position to your parents, clearly and unequivocally, though perhaps with a degree of filial diplomacy, if you wish to maintain some semblance of a relationship. Second, I will draft a formal letter to the corporate trustee, reiterating the terms of the trust, your status as sole beneficiary, and explicitly stating that any requests for disbursements made by third parties, including your parents, for purposes not aligned with the trust objectives, are to be denied and reported immediately to you and to my office." This was the course of action I had anticipated. A clear statement of fact, backed by legal authority. "There's also the matter of how they intend to pursue this," Alastair continued. "Are they likely to try to pressure the trustee directly, or will they focus their efforts on manipulating you?" "The latter, almost certainly," I replied. They see the trustee as a faceless institution. I am the more accessible, in their eyes, more malleable party. Then your resolve will be tested, Julian, Alastair said. But the law, in this instance, is firmly on your side. And so, I might add, is the clear and well-documented intent of your grandfather. I thanked Alastair and ended the call, a sense of grim preparedness settling over me. This was not going to be a pleasant conversation with my parents, but it was a necessary one. My grandfather had entrusted me with his legacy, not for it to be squandered on fleeting luxuries for those who had already benefited greatly from his generosity during his lifetime. He had provided for my mother. This trust was for me. The battle lines were being drawn, not of my choosing, but I would defend them with the same meticulous diligence I applied to every complex case that crossed my desk. My parents had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my respect for acquiescence. They were about to receive a lesson in forensic analysis, applied not to a dusty will from centuries past, but to the very living, breathing, and legally binding document that stood between them and my grandfather's carefully protected legacy. Armed with Alastair Finch's counsel and a renewed understanding of the unassailable legal position of the Hamilton Trust, I braced myself for the inevitable follow-up from my parents. It came 3 days later in the form of a Sunday afternoon visit, unannounced, as was their occasional custom when they had something they considered important to discuss, important to them. That is, my mother, Beatrice, swept into my apartment, a flurry of floral print and determined optimism. My father, Arthur, trailing in her wake, carrying a plate of her slightly too dry lemon drizzle cake, a traditional offering meant to soften the recipient for the impending request or pronouncement. "Julian, darling, we were just in the neighborhood," she began, her voice bright, as she surveyed my living room, her gaze lingering on a recently acquired antique map I'd framed, a map Grandpa Thomas had given me. "Such a lovely, quiet little place you have. Though a bit small, isn't it? Once we have a conservatory, you must come for Sunday lunches more often. It will be so light and airy." The groundwork was being laid, the assumption of my compliance already woven into her vision of their expanded lifestyle. My father placed the cake on my coffee table with a thud. "Your mother's very excited about the plans, Julian. Got the brochures out already. Top-of-the-line glass, self-cleaning, the works." I invited them to sit, offering tea, which my mother accepted with a gracious nod, as if I were merely a junior functionary in her grand design. Once settled, teacups in hand, she got straight to the point. "So, dear, have you had a chance to give some thought to our little chat the other day? About helping us with the conservatory and your father's car?" Her smile was beatific, confident. "Yes, Mother, I have," I replied, my tone calm and measured. "I've reviewed the terms of Grandpa Thomas's trust in detail, and I've also consulted with my solicitor, Alastair Finch, who, as you may recall, also advised Grandpa on estate matters." The mention of a solicitor, and particularly one familiar with Grandpa Thomas's affairs, caused a subtle shift in her demeanor. The bright smile flickered just for a moment. My father shifted uncomfortably in his armchair. "A solicitor, Julian," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Isn't that a bit formal? This is a family matter. Grandpa Thomas's trust is a formal legal instrument, Father," I replied, "and its terms are quite specific. The funds are designated for my sole benefit, for purposes aligned with long-term security and significant personal or professional development. Disbursements for third-party home improvements or vehicle purchases, unfortunately, do not fall within those parameters. The corporate trustee simply would not, and legally could not, authorize such a use of the funds." My mother placed her teacup down with a sharp click. The smile was gone now, replaced by a look of affronted disbelief. "Not fall within the parameters? Julian, what are you saying? Are you refusing to help your own parents?" "I'm saying, Mother, that the trust, as Grandpa Thomas designed it, does not permit me to use those funds in the way you're suggesting. It's not a matter of my willingness or unwillingness. It's a matter of legal obligation and fiduciary duty on the part of the trustee, and my own duty to honor my grandfather's explicit wishes." "His wishes?" Her voice rose slightly. Thomas would have wanted us to be comfortable, to enjoy our later years. He always provided for us, and he did provide for you generously throughout his life, and in his will, separate from this trust, I countered gently but firmly. This particular trust was established with a different purpose, a purpose he and I discussed at great length. It was for my future, for my long-term security. My father, sensing my mother's escalating indignation, attempted to intervene. Now, Julian, your mother's not asking for the moon. Just a little help. A conservatory would be lovely, and my car, well, it's on its last legs. Father, I said, turning to him, with all due respect, those are wants, not needs that would justify breaking the terms of a legally binding trust established by Grandpa Thomas. If you need a new car, perhaps we can discuss a more conventional loan, or look at your own savings and budget. But the Hamilton Trust is not a family slush fund. The term slush fund clearly struck a nerve. My mother's face flushed a dull red. How dare you, Julian? After all we've done for you, the sacrifices we've made. Sacrifices. This was a familiar refrain, one she often deployed when her desires were thwarted. The narrative of her parental martyrdom, however, did not align with the archival evidence of my upbringing, which had been comfortable, secure, and largely funded by Grandpa Thomas's generosity towards her. Mother, I appreciate everything you and Father have done, I said, trying to keep the escalating emotion out of my voice. But this inheritance, this trust, is a separate matter, governed by my grandfather's explicit instructions. It's not something I can simply dip into for non-approved expenses, however much I might wish to accommodate your desires. So, you don't wish to accommodate our desires? She pressed, her voice sharp. You'd rather see that money just sitting there, benefiting no one, while your own parents are dreaming of a small improvement to their home? It is benefiting someone, Mother, I said quietly. It is benefiting me, as Grandpa Thomas intended, by providing a secure foundation for my future. And it is not just sitting there. It is being prudently managed and invested, again, as per his instructions. The atmosphere in my small living room had become decidedly frosty. The lemon drizzle cake sat on the coffee table, untouched, a symbol of their failed diplomatic mission. My father looked deflated, his dreams of a new car receding. My mother, however, was gearing up for a different tactic. Her eyes narrowed. Alistair Finch, you said? That old stick-in-the-mud lawyer of your grandfather's? I'll just call the trustee myself. They'll listen to me. I'm Thomas Hamilton's daughter, after all. I sighed internally. This was the persistence Alistair had warned me about. Mother, the corporate trustee is legally bound by the trust document, not by familial sentiment. They will tell you exactly what I have told you. In fact, Alistair Finch is sending them a letter to reiterate these points and to ensure they are aware that any unauthorized attempts to access or influence the disbursement of funds will be met with a firm legal response. Her jaw dropped. A legal response? Against your own mother? Against anyone who attempts to unlawfully interfere with the terms of a legally established trust, Mother. It's not personal, it's procedural. And it's for my protection, as Grandpa Thomas intended. The visit ended shortly thereafter, with my mother departing in a state of high dudgeon, my father trailing miserably behind her, the lemon drizzle cake abandoned on my coffee table. The initial engagement had been repulsed, but I knew this was likely just the first wave. My mother was not one to accept defeat easily, especially when she believed she was entitled. The integrity of the archive, it seemed, would require ongoing vigilance. The week following my parents' acrimonious departure from my apartment was quiet, an uneasy lull before what I anticipated would be the next storm. My mother, Beatrice, was a master of indirect warfare, and I knew she wouldn't let the matter of the Hamilton Trust rest, especially now that her initial, direct assault had been repelled. Alistair Finch's formal letter to the corporate trustee had, as expected, solidified their position. The trustee, a rather staid and eminently correct institution named Provident Fiduciary Services, had replied promptly to Alistair, confirming their adherence to the trust's explicit terms and acknowledging his instruction that all communications regarding the trust particularly any from third parties, should be routed through his office. They also noted, with a touch of dry corporate understatement, that they had indeed received a rather impassioned phone call from a Mrs. Beatrice Croft, my mother's maiden name, which she occasionally used when trying to add a layer of old family gravitas to her requests, inquiring about the flexibility of her late father's testamentary wishes. They had, of course, politely but firmly reiterated the trust's unyielding structure. My mother's next move, when it came, was classic Beatrice, an attempt to rally familial support and apply emotional pressure. It began with a series of phone calls to my aunts, uncles, and cousins, a carefully curated narrative painting me as the ungrateful, selfish son, hoarding a vast fortune while his deserving parents were left to languish in a home desperately in need of a conservatory and with a patriarch forced to drive a shabby automobile. I started receiving concerned calls myself. My Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, and a woman whose heart was considerably larger than her grasp of legal complexities, called first. "Julian, dear, your mother is so upset. She says you're being rather uncooperative about helping them with a few small things. You know, your grandfather always wanted the family to be close, to support each other." "Aunt Carol," I explained patiently, "this isn't about being uncooperative. It's about honoring Grandpa Thomas's explicit wishes as laid out in a legally binding trust. The money he left for me has specific conditions attached to its use. A conservatory for my parents' house, unfortunately, isn't one of them." "Oh, but surely, dear, there's some leeway for family." Her voice was laced with genuine, if misguided, concern, no doubt fueled by Beatrice's dramatic retelling of events. I reiterated the legal realities, emphasizing the corporate trustee's fiduciary duty and my own obligation to respect my grandfather's intent. Aunt Carol sounded confused, but eventually conceded that legal things can be so complicated. Similar calls followed from other relatives, each echoing my mother's carefully crafted talking points. It was a coordinated campaign of guilt and implied familial obligation. I handled each call with the same calm, factual explanation, refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments or to cast blame on my mother directly, simply stating the legal and ethical constraints I was under. My profession as a forensic genealogist and estate researcher, while often viewed by my family as somewhat esoteric, now provided an unexpected shield. When I spoke of fiduciary duties, irrevocable trusts, and testamentary intent, the terms, while perhaps not fully understood, carried a certain weight, a suggestion of immutable legal realities that even Beatrice's emotional appeals could not easily overcome. The most challenging encounter was with my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe had always been closer to our mother, more susceptible to her emotional weather systems. She called me, her voice tight with an indignation that was clearly secondhand. "Julian, Mom is heartbroken. She feels you're completely abandoning her and Dad. That money Grandpa left, it's more than you'll ever need. Why can't you just help them out a little? It's not like they're asking for the whole thing, just enough for the conservatory and Dad's car. It's about respect. Julian, respect for our parents." This was a more direct assault. Chloe, unlike Aunt Carol, wasn't just concerned, she was accusatory. "Chloe," I began, my voice firm but still calm, "my respect for Mom and Dad is a separate issue from my legal and moral obligation to honor Grandpa Thomas's will. He set up that trust for specific reasons, to provide for my long-term security. He made other provisions for Mom in his will, provisions she has already benefited from. This trust is different. It's not a family piggy bank. So, you're saying your long-term security is more important than Mom's happiness right now?" Chloe retorted. "She's been dreaming of that conservatory for years. Mom's happiness, Chloe, shouldn't be contingent on raiding a trust fund that wasn't intended for her," I said. "And her dreams, however long-standing, don't supersede Grandpa's legally documented wishes. This isn't about me valuing my security over her happiness. It's about me upholding my grandfather's explicit instructions and the legal integrity of the trust he established." I then explained, in simple terms, the role of the corporate trustee and the legal impossibility of what she and Mom were suggesting. I also hinted, very subtly, that attempting to coerce a beneficiary or unduly influence a trustee could have unwelcome legal consequences. Chloe was silent for a moment. The mention of legal consequences, however veiled, seemed to penetrate her indignation. "So, there's nothing you can do, even if you wanted to?" she asked, her tone shifting slightly from accusation to a grudging curiosity. "Not with the trust funds, Chloe. Not for those purposes." Grandpa Thomas was very clear and very thorough. He wanted to ensure this legacy was protected for me, and I intend to honor that. The conversation ended on a more subdued note. Chloe wasn't convinced, perhaps, but she was clearly beginning to understand that this wasn't a simple matter of my being stubborn or ungenerous. It was a matter of legal and ethical boundaries Grandpa Thomas himself had erected. My mother's campaign of familial pressure, while emotionally draining for me, was ultimately proving ineffective against the clear, cold logic of the law and the well-documented intent of the deceased. She was discovering, much to her chagrin, that some archives are not open to revisionist interpretation, no matter how passionately argued. The integrity of the record, in this case, the Hamilton Trust, was holding firm, but I suspected Beatrice was not yet ready to concede. She was, if nothing else, resourceful in her pursuit of what she believed she was owed. I needed to remain vigilant. Her next move might be less direct, more insidious. The forensic researcher in me remained on high alert. True to my suspicions, Beatrice's next move was indeed more insidious, a classic pincer movement involving an attempt to undermine my credibility while simultaneously feigning a newfound understanding and desire for reconciliation. It began subtly, with a series of overly solicitous phone calls. "Julian, dear, I've been doing some thinking," she said one evening, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that immediately set my internal alarms jangling. And perhaps I was a bit hasty, a bit emotional about the conservatory. "Of course, your grandfather's wishes are paramount. I just want us to be a happy family. Perhaps you could come over for dinner next week? Just us. We could talk, clear the air." This was uncharacteristic. Beatrice did not do contrition well, if at all. Her apologies were usually of the non-apology variety. "I'm sorry if you were upset by what I said, but you have to understand my position." This sudden pivot to sweet reason and a desire for rapprochement felt like a carefully baited trap. I agreed to the dinner, of course. Refusing would only fuel her narrative of my being cold and unforgiving. But I went with my metaphorical research kit fully packed, my senses on high alert for any deviation from expected behavioral norms. The dinner itself was a masterclass in passive aggression and subtle manipulation. My father, Arthur, was unusually quiet, looking uncomfortable, while Beatrice fussed over me, plying me with my favorite dishes, or what she remembered as my favorite dishes from 20 years ago, and reminiscing about my childhood in a way that painted her as the ever-sacrificing, doting mother. The conversation inevitably circled back to finances, but this time, her approach was different. She didn't mention the conservatory or the car directly. Instead, she spoke vaguely of rising costs, of unexpected repairs needed for the house, of her desire to perhaps start a small online business, a craft boutique she suggested, to keep her mind active and contribute a little something. She then, with a carefully feigned casualness, asked if I knew any reliable financial advisors. "Just someone to help me make sense of my own little savings, dear," she said, fluttering her eyelashes. "Someone trustworthy. You're so good with all that complicated money stuff, Julian. Perhaps you could recommend someone? Or even help me look over a few things yourself? Just a second pair of eyes." I saw the trap immediately. She was trying to gain access to my financial expertise, perhaps to find a loophole in the trust, or to glean information about my personal finances beyond the trust, or even to try and embroil me in some new scheme of hers under the guise of seeking my advice. "Mother," I said, my tone polite but firm, "my expertise is in historical estates and genealogical research, not contemporary financial planning for small businesses. And I make it a strict policy never to give financial advice to family members. It can complicate relationships, as I'm sure you understand." However, Alastair Finch My solicitor works with several reputable independent financial advisors. I'd be happy to ask him for a list of names you could contact." Her smile tightened. My refusal to be drawn in, and the mention of Alistair Finch, was clearly not the response she'd hoped for. The dinner ended with a strained politeness. But the second prong of her attack was already in motion, and it was far more malevolent. A few days later, I received a call from Mrs. Henderson, a distant cousin on my father's side, a woman known more for her propensity for gossip than for her sound judgment. "Julian, dear," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "I felt I had to call you. There are some rather worrying rumors circulating in the family about your stability." "My stability, Mrs. Henderson?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Yes. Beatrice is terribly worried, of course. She's been saying that, well, that since your grandfather passed, you haven't been quite yourself, that you've become reclusive, a bit paranoid about money, even making some rather unsound financial decisions with the inheritance. She's concerned you might be vulnerable to exploitation, or that you're not capable of managing such a large sum on your own." This was a vicious, calculated slander. Beatrice wasn't just trying to get her hands on the money anymore. She was trying to discredit me, to paint me as incompetent, perhaps even to lay the groundwork for a future challenge to my ability to manage my own affairs, or even to the validity of Grandpa Thomas's decision to entrust me with the inheritance in the first place. The sheer, unadulterated malice of it took my breath away for a moment. This wasn't just greed. This was character assassination. I thanked Mrs. Henderson for her concern and ended the call, my mind racing. Beatrice was playing a dangerous game. Such rumors, if allowed to fester, could have serious repercussions, not just within the family, but potentially even for my professional reputation, which relied on an image of meticulousness, integrity, and sound judgment. I immediately called Alistair Finch. "Alistair," I said, dispensing with pleasantries, "it appears my mother has escalated her campaign. She's now spreading rumors within the family that I am mentally unstable and incapable of managing my finances." Alistair listened, his only comment a sharp intake of breath. "Defamation, Julian," he said when I'd finished, "and a particularly nasty form of it. This is no longer just about the trust. This is an attack on your person. We need to shut this down hard and fast." He advised 2 immediate actions. First, a cease and desist letter directly to Beatrice, outlining the defamatory nature of her statements and warning her of the legal consequences if she continued. Second, a carefully worded communication to key family members, those who were influential or particularly susceptible to Beatrice's manipulations, clarifying the situation, reaffirming my sound management of my affairs, perhaps with a discreet, anonymized endorsement from the corporate trustee about the professional handling of the Hamilton Trust, and subtly warning them about the legal implications of spreading false and damaging information. "We need to control the narrative, Julian," Alistair said. "Your mother has attempted to seize it with lies. We will reclaim it with documented facts." He also suggested I gather any evidence of these rumors, emails, voicemails, or even written accounts of conversations from family members willing to provide them. Mrs. Henderson, despite her gossipy nature, was fundamentally a decent person. She might be willing to state what Beatrice had told her if approached correctly. This was a new, uglier phase of the conflict. My mother wasn't just a grasping, entitled woman. She was proving to be a ruthless and destructive opponent. But the principles of forensic research still applied. Gather the evidence, analyze the patterns, document the facts, and present an unassailable case. The archive of her deceit was growing, and with each new entry, her position weakened, while mine, rooted in truth and legality, grew stronger. The conservatory and the new car were looking less likely by the day. Her own reputation, however, was now squarely in the path of her reckless ambition. The cease and desist letter drafted by Alistair Finch was a masterpiece of legal precision and thinly veiled threat. It was delivered to my mother by registered mail, requiring her signature. I imagined the scene. Beatrice, perhaps expecting a belated check for the conservatory fund or an invitation to another conciliatory dinner, instead receiving a stark, formal document outlining her defamatory statements and the potential for legal action, including claims for damages to my reputation. The effect, I later learned through a somewhat chastened Aunt Carol, was explosive. Beatrice apparently went into a full-blown tirade, accusing Alastair Finch of being a scheming ambulance chaser and me of being an unnatural, ungrateful son, brainwashed by lawyers. Her performance, however, was reportedly met with a new level of skepticism by some family members, particularly after Alastair's carefully worded countercommunication began to circulate. This countercommunication, sent to a select list of relatives, didn't accuse Beatrice directly. Instead, it calmly stated that I, Julian Thorne, was in full possession of my faculties, managing my affairs with prudence and in accordance with the explicit wishes of my late grandfather, Thomas Hamilton. It mentioned that the Hamilton Trust was under professional corporate management, ensuring its integrity and adherence to legal and ethical standards. It also included a discreet but firm reminder about the legal definition of defamation and the potential liabilities associated with disseminating unsubstantiated and harmful falsehoods. The impact was significant. Several relatives who had initially been swayed by Beatrice's tearful pronouncements called me, not to pressure me this time, but to apologize for having doubted me, or to express their dismay at Beatrice's tactics. Mrs. Henderson, the gossipy cousin, even offered to provide a written statement detailing what Beatrice had told her, an offer Alastair gratefully accepted. It seemed my mother's attempt to weaponize family opinion had backfired spectacularly, isolating her further and damaging her own credibility. In the midst of this, my father, Arthur, made an unexpected move. He called me, his voice hesitant, almost fearful. "Julian," he began, "your mother, she's not taking this well. The letter from your lawyer, she's beside herself." "Father," I said, my tone calm, but unyielding, "mother's distress is a direct consequence of her own actions. Spreading false rumors about my mental stability and financial competence is a serious matter. It's defamatory, and it had to be addressed." I know, he mumbled. "But this legal business, Julian, it's tearing the family apart. It was Mother's attempt to override Grandpa Thomas's will and seize my inheritance that initiated this legal business. Father, my actions have been purely defensive, aimed at protecting my rights and my reputation." There was a long pause. Then, Arthur said something that truly surprised me. "Julian, about the inheritance, your grandfather, he talked to me. Before he passed, he told me he was setting up that trust for you. He said he wanted to make sure you had a fair start, something that was truly yours, protected. He knew your mother, and I hadn't always been the best with money. He wanted you to be secure." This was a revelation. Arthur had known about Grandpa Thomas's intentions all along, yet he had stood by silently while Beatrice launched her campaign. His guilt, it seemed, was finally outweighing his fear of his wife's temper. "Why didn't you say something sooner, Father?" I asked, a note of genuine curiosity rather than accusation in my voice. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "Your mother, she can be very persuasive, Julian. Very determined. It's easier, sometimes, to just go along. But this talk of you being unwell, that's not right. Thomas will be furious." His admission, though belated, was significant. It was a crack in the united front Beatrice had tried to project. It also provided another valuable piece of corroborating evidence regarding Grandpa Thomas's intent, should it ever be needed. I suggested to Arthur that if he truly wished to help resolve the situation, he might consider speaking to Beatrice, urging her to retract her false statements and to accept the legal reality of the Hamilton Trust. He sounded doubtful of his ability to influence her, but promised to try. The following week, Alastair Finch received a letter. It was not from Beatrice, but from a new solicitor, a Mr. Alastair Carmichael. The proliferation of Alastairs in this saga was becoming almost comical, representing Mrs. Beatrice Croft. The letter was a carefully worded retreat. It stated that Mrs. Croft categorically denied making any defamatory statements, but acknowledged that there had been familial misunderstandings regarding the nature of the Hamilton Trust. It further stated that Mrs. Croft now fully accepted the terms of the said trust and would make no further claims upon it or attempt to influence its beneficiary. It was, in essence, a surrender, wrapped in a thin veneer of legal face-saving. Beatrice had clearly been advised that her position was untenable, her tactics counterproductive, and her potential legal exposure significant. The rumors ceased. The concerned phone calls from relatives stopped. An uneasy peace settled over the family, though the fault lines Beatrice's actions had exposed would likely remain for a long time. My inheritance was secure. My reputation, thanks to Alastair Finch's swift and decisive action, was intact. My mother, I suspected, was nursing a monumental sense of grievance, but she was also, for the first time in a long while, constrained by the undeniable power of documented fact and legal consequence. She had mistaken my quiet, methodical nature for weakness. She had learned, the hard way, that a forensic genealogist and estate researcher, when provoked, can be a formidable opponent, especially when the archive of evidence is overwhelmingly in their favor. Grandpa Thomas, I thought with a grim smile, would have appreciated the thoroughness of the defense. His legacy was safe, and I had, in a very real sense, honored his trust in me, not just by preserving the funds, but by defending the integrity of his wishes against those who sought to undermine them. The conservatory remained unbuilt. The shabby car remained in my father's driveway, and the Hamilton Trust remained exactly as its founder had intended, a secure foundation for my future. The dust settled slowly after Beatrice's formal retreat. There were no more direct confrontations, no more whispered campaigns of defamation. The family, by and large, seemed relieved that the unpleasantness was over, though a certain awkwardness lingered in my interactions with some relatives who had perhaps been too quick to believe my mother's initial narrative. I didn't hold it against them. Beatrice could be a very convincing actress when she chose to be. My relationship with my parents, however, had undergone a fundamental and irreparable shift. The casual ease, the taken-for-granted familial bond, was gone, replaced by a carefully maintained, almost formal distance. We saw each other at obligatory family gatherings, holidays, significant birthdays, but the conversations were stilted, superficial, carefully avoiding any topic that might lead back to the sensitive ground of finances or inheritance. Beatrice was civil, even occasionally making an effort to be pleasant, but there was a new wariness in her eyes when she looked at me, a grudging respect, perhaps, for the son she had so profoundly underestimated. Arthur, my father, seemed more at ease, almost as if a weight had been lifted from him. His belated admission of Grandpa Thomas's true intentions had, I think, been a significant step for him, a small act of asserting his own conscience over his wife's domineering influence. He started calling me more often, just to chat, to ask about my work, to talk about the mundane things fathers and sons discuss. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, but it was a quiet rebuilding of a connection that had long been overshadowed. My sister, Chloe, also reached out. She apologized, awkwardly but sincerely, for her initial accusatory stance. "I should have known better, Julian," she'd said. "Mom she knows how to push my buttons. But what she did, trying to say you were unwell, that was awful. I'm really sorry I didn't see it sooner." I accepted her apology. Chloe was, at heart, a decent person, just easily swayed. The ordeal had, perhaps, taught her a valuable lesson about critical thinking and resisting emotional manipulation. As for the Hamilton Trust, it continued to be managed prudently by Provident Fiduciary Services, its assets growing steadily, a quiet testament to Grandpa Thomas's foresight. I made no extravagant withdrawals. I continued to live modestly, my primary satisfaction coming from my work and the quiet comforts of a well-ordered life. The inheritance was not a treasure chest to be plundered, but a safety net, a resource for future possibilities, exactly as my grandfather had intended. About a year after the conservatory crisis, as Alastair Finch drily referred to it, I decided to use a portion of the trust's income for a purpose I knew Grandpa Thomas would have wholeheartedly approved of. He had always been a passionate advocate for education and historical preservation. I established a small, annual grant in his name, the Thomas Hamilton Historical Research Grant, to support promising young scholars working on projects related to local history and archival studies, the very fields he knew I loved. The grant was administered through the Historical Institute where I worked, and the first recipient was a bright young PhD student researching the lives of 19th-century immigrant women in our region, using primary source documents that were often overlooked. Presenting her with the grant, seeing her genuine excitement and gratitude, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was what Grandpa Thomas had meant by building something lasting. It wasn't about conservatories or new cars. It was about investing in knowledge, in the preservation of our shared past, in the potential of future generations. My mother, when she heard about the grant, made no comment, at least not to me. But Aunt Carol told me that Beatrice had remarked, rather sourly, that it was typical of Julian to throw good money after dusty old papers instead of helping his own family. Some archives, it seemed, remained stubbornly resistant to new acquisitions of understanding. Life continued. My work as a forensic genealogist brought me new challenges, new puzzles to unravel from the tangled threads of the past. I helped reunite long-lost family members, uncovered hidden inheritances for deserving heirs, and occasionally exposed fraudulent claims with the same meticulous, evidence-based approach I had, regrettably, been forced to apply to my own family affairs. The experience with my parents had been painful, a stark lesson in the corrosive power of greed and entitlement. But it had also been clarifying. It had forced me to define my own boundaries, to stand up for my rights, and to appreciate, more deeply than ever, the quiet strength of integrity and the enduring value of a well-protected legacy. Grandpa Thomas had left me more than just money. He had left me a blueprint for resilience, a testament to the importance of foresight, and an unwavering belief in the power of truth, meticulously documented and staunchly defended. His vessel, the one he had entrusted to me, remained sound, its contents secure, its purpose clear. And that, I knew, was the best way to honor his memory and the most satisfying form of personal and financial well-being.